Hello, I'm Arne de Kaiser, who along with my colleague Neil Horner are spearheading Weston Voices, an oral history project sponsored by the Weston Historical Society. Today is July 30th, 2015, and I'm here with Patricia Steiner Heifetz, a resident of Weston for 5 decades. I'm interviewing her at her apartment in Meadow Ridge, a retirement community in Reading, Connecticut. Pat was a strong presence in Weston, known for her vigorous opinions expressed often in public meetings and, particularly, through the editorial she wrote in the Weston Forum, the indispensable local newspaper she founded in 1970. Her policy, still to be found on the masthead of the paper today, was, "We seek to present all news and issues pertaining to Weston in an accurate, objective, nonpartisan way." Thank you for welcoming us into your home, Patricia. Let me begin by asking you about your background. Where were you born? Where were you raised? Where did you go to school? And what was your major?
Well, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, which is important now because I can barely breathe because it was the terrible air in Youngstown. And in the winter we went to Florida. And then my father died when I was 11 and we moved to Florida. So then I lived in Florida until I went to college. And I went to college by looking at a map and picking a place far away from Florida. And there it was called Wisconsin. And that is how I have a degree in the School of Journalism from the University of Wisconsin and also a degree in political science.
Oh, and your husband Paul was also well known in Weston, of course, and very much respected for his volunteer work on the Planning and Zoning Commission and other boards, as well as for his wonderful paintings. When did you meet him, marry him, and when did you move to Weston, and why? What was so attractive about the town?
Well, actually, we did not intend to live in Weston. We were there temporarily, deciding where we were going to go and live, because we had been living in Copenhagen for 3 years, and then we came back and we lived in Ridgefield for a year, looking for where we were going to go, and then Paul decided he was going to start commuting to New York, so we had to move from there because you can't commute to New York from there. And so we found a place quickly, and it happened to be in Weston. And so we said, okay, we'll just live here a short time while we find a place to live. And that was what, almost more than 50 years ago.
So it was total serendipity.
Yes, yes.
Interesting. And when you moved here, what was the town like then? What were your first impressions?
Well, it was for us. It was just a place to be at the time, and of course we have kids. Unfortunately, we did not know that the school that one of my daughters was going to go to had burned down, and so she couldn't go to school in Weston. And they sent the kids to Westport, to the temple there, where they had rooms during the week. And so, I mean, everything was very temporary as far as we were concerned. My in-laws lived in Clinton, Connecticut, so that was why we ended up in Connecticut at that point.
So, but at some point you got very involved with the town. You started to know people and get acquainted. Tell us about that early period.
Yes, at first, well, because when you have children, you start meeting people right away, and then I was pregnant. And I had one son who was 2, and my 2 daughters. One daughter was in the last class out of Staples High School from Weston, and then Marilee, who was in the one who was in the school that burned down, which is now the North House in Weston. And so that was, and I got involved because I was always very active in the League of Women Voters, and so I did work for the League of Women Voters. And that's how I ended up with the newspaper, because I started off with the League of Women Voters covering the first Charter Revision Commission that Weston had. And they called in everybody from different groups in town and asked one question: what is the biggest lack in Weston? And everybody said lack of communication. So I realized this was foolish of me to be doing what I was doing, and I should go and start a newspaper, well, work on a newspaper. And there were no newspapers in Weston. Weston had absolutely no communication. And Westport was the closest one, and every time they would say the first selectman or the this or that, they meant Westport. They never meant Weston, because they never covered Weston at all. So I decided we had that's when we were buying the Rebson property, and there was a big vote, but of course no one knew how it came out. So I took a paper, and with my little typewriter, I wrote a thing, and I called it the Weston Forum, and we passed it out to people at the Memorial Day Fair. Between the parade and the fair, we passed out all these papers telling them what had happened in this referendum. So that was the first people knew about it. Anyway, and I thought that was the end of that as far as I was concerned. And then one of the people sitting there was Dick Voigt, who had spinning the restaurant in Westport he had started.
Not the pepper mill?
The pepper mill. And he said to me, you know, you're going to have advertising. I said, for what? Because this was the end as far as I was concerned. And he said, well, you have to keep this up, you know. This is what Weston needs, is a newspaper, and I will keep my ad in there as long as you have the newspaper, as long as you keep it going. And I laughed. But sure enough, once the paper came out and they started calling me up about this and that and everything else. And we became the communication center. And then next thing I knew, it was the following week, and then the following week, and pretty soon it was August, and the first issue of the Weston Forum came out on August the 5th of 1970. And that's how it happened, and then it just keeps going. But everybody in town worked on that paper.
Talk a little bit more about the mission, because you told us earlier that basically, in addition to the editorial statement that I read earlier, you said turning a discombobulated town into a community.
In the first letters to the editor, it was either Jim Daniel or what's his name, Mort Schindel. One or the other wrote a letter and said in that this is what the news forum has done for Weston. It turns a discombobulated area into a town. That was, and I never forgot that. I thought that was a great thing.
The other thing I would characterize about the Weston Forum is that in many ways it seems like it was a voice for keeping Weston the way it was. Would you characterize it like that?
Well, I mean, it was the way it was at the time. Whatever it was like, that's what the paper reflected. I mean, the paper reflected everybody in town and what was going on. We did not, for instance, we did not ever print stories about people's parties unless everybody was invited and that kind of thing. I mean, the paper was literally the town's paper. It was everybody's. I felt like, which I was. I mean, I was like the servant keeping it going, and that was it.
Yeah. You mentioned the town, the changes in the town. Tell me a little bit about some of the changes that...
Right, it was just starting to change, and what was causing this change was the fact that corporations were all building new headquarters because the laws have changed, and they were making, getting good tax deductions and all for building headquarters, and they were all building headquarters out in Westchester and in Connecticut, and the families were moving in. So all these families started moving into Weston.
This was in the 50s and 60s?
In the 60s, and then the early 70s. That's when the companies were all turning over all the time. They don't do that anymore because it's too expensive. But that's what they were doing at the time. And that's how Weston built.
And one more question about the editorial policy of the paper. As I mentioned, it really had a very strong editorial voice. Yeah. Would you characterize it as being head cheerleader for the town, keeping a gimlet eye on government, somehow demanding of the population, challenging of the status quo? Do any of these words ring a bell to you?
Well, I mean, as I say, the paper became its own thing. I mean, the paper was like its own thing, and I was just like the caretaker. and everybody else in town, everybody wrote something for the paper at some time.
Yes, tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, because, I mean, every organization learned about publicity, which they never knew before, because we never had, you know, a place to put it. But so they started to keep sending things in, and we kept on printing and printing and printing. And we came out every single week. Every single week. And one time there was a hurricane. And the hurricane came just the day before we went to press. We went to press on Tuesdays. And that hurricane came on a Monday. And sure enough, that morning my daughter and I went out with a Polaroid right after the hurricane stopped. And we took pictures all over. And we were the only newspaper in the area that had hurricane pictures that day. Because went right to press.
This was in 1955, that hurricane.
No, it was.
That one?
No, it was because the paper started in 70,
Of course.
so it had to be. It was in 70 something.
Of course.
Probably.
Yeah. And then you had other people writing for the paper as well. You couldn't do this all by yourself.
Oh no, Jane Smith came to the Forum almost immediately when I started it, and she had one baby. And she ended up having all her babies on the Forum while she was working on the Forum. And she did P&Z, and she became the expert in the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Oh.
And she would get called up all the time asking, you know, what about this, what about that? But she's the only one who knew everything about it. Well, this was after Bob Turner, of course.
Yeah. Other features of the paper included a series of resident profiles.
Yes.
Part of the town history that, you know, the paper is still available in print at the Weston Public Library. But tell us a little bit about those resident profiles and how you developed them and
Right,
who
we
the people
started off,
were.
one of the things, one of the features we had in the paper was Profile Weston. The first one was John Fanton, because his ancestors had bought the property, bought what became Weston, from the Indians. So he was the first Profile Weston. And the second one was Judge Harlan. And because, of course, he was the Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And I don't even remember whether we went on with that or didn't go on with that. Probably B. Waring, we probably had her on.
So really it was a recounting of historic people who were here historically.
Yes.
More than it was people who were active in the town at the time that you
well,
had the
as far
paper.
as long as we ran that we didn't run that all the time.
Right.
Because we kept, I mean, we had always had a big space problem. The New York Times had a slogan, all the news that's fit to print. And we had all the news that fits we print. So.
But surely over the years, you met a lot of characters in town. A lot of people who became well known in town. And
Yeah.
tell us, reminisce a little bit about some of those people.
Well, you know, it was interesting. I don't even remember. I'm bad at remembering names, but the one thing I do recall when you asked that question is when we had we used to have plays in Weston. I don't even remember the names of them, but we were going to have the Weston Bicentennial, and when we were going to have the Weston Bicentennial, there was a man in Weston who was one of the best known of, he was what was the name of their group? He was one of the groups who sang.
Oh, with the Weavers.
The Weavers. And he probably still lives in Weston, and I called him up and asked him if he would contribute to that, if he would be, join in at that, and he was very receptive, and he did a song for that when we ran it, when we had that play. There was, everybody, at the time that the Forum was growing, was developing, it's really when Weston was developing, because it had just been a farm place, and there were few farmers because the land was bad. But it was when, at this time when Jim Daniel had come in, and Jim Daniel was the first selectman, and he started different kinds of commissions and things in town, which they never had. of course, the historic district commission, a lot of them. Anyway, and that started the forum, really. I mean, it took a lot of space, but everybody had their news items in the forum. And of course, each agent, everybody had to do their own articles, and they'd bring them in and we'd edit them.
Every town has its characters. Certainly Weston has had its share.
Yes.
Do you remember anyone that sticks out, anyone who sticks out in your mind?
You mean as characters,
As
good
characters,
or bad?
yes.
Good or bad? I got one. There was a woman in town. As a matter of fact, she was a woman, but she was known for years ago. There was something called the broomstick skirt. She had been the one who developed the broomstick skirt. What it was, I remembered it because we wore them in school. And there were skirts that you would tie, wrap around and wash them, and you didn't have to iron them. You'd wrap them around a broomstick, and that would. Anyhow, this woman, she came to Weston. She was living in Weston, and her husband was chairman of the Board of Finance, and she just took over everything. She would go into town hall and say, I am the Betty Frist, the wife of the chairman of the Board of Finance. And she would write things constantly and bring them in, beautifully typed, perfectly spelled, every word right, except none of them made any sense. And she's the one who, there still is a flicker, you know, that yellow flicker near Cobb's Mill, where you turn off to go.
The blinking light.
The blinking light. The way that got there was because she one day was driving home and the sand in the road had caused a motorcyclist to fall down. So she saw that, so she wrote a letter, one of her letters, to the state. And of course they couldn't make any sense of it, what it was. They didn't know what she wanted. And so they put up the blinker and it's still there. And she did some things that were very wrong and very dangerous to other people. But like what she did, she lived, Jim Daniel was very forward. He had thought of a lot of things that the town should do. He had turned the dump, was turning it into a landfill. It was the first one around the state. It was a very good thing. And she got after him. She was going to get him because she did not want garbage trucks. She lived across the street from the place that's now called Lakeville area. And that is where he found all this landfill that we would need for the dump. And not having the dump, for having the landfill. And she didn't want garbage trucks across the street from her house. And so she really did rotten things.
You're talking about the area that's now the
Lakeville.
The
Lakeside
used to be the
Drive.
quarry.
No, I'm right.
Where's Lakeside
It's
Drive?
right. It's where you turn to go if you want to go to the school. If you're on. If you're going straight on after Weston Road, you keep going straight.
Right.
And then if there's a section, there's a piece of the lake, of the river that's a
Yes,
lake.
I know where you.
That's Lakeside.
I know where you.
That's it.
Yeah, interesting.
Anyhow.
Another memorable character.
Any other one? Oh, there are lots of people who are, I mean, of course, people who did great things. Like, I think Fred Moore did great things for Weston. And an interesting thing they had in Weston, which they did not have women in any of the volunteer forces. We did not have a police department at the time, but we had marshals and
there were state troopers.
no women were ever allowed to be in any one of these agencies. The fire department, nobody. Anyway, one day, and the firemen used to have a stag dinner once a year, and they would honor one of their firemen. And one year I invited my husband. That was really close to the time I'd started the forum. And they invited my husband, and so he went. And he came home. I said, "What was that all about?" Because this was a stag. He said, "Well, they were really honoring you." but they couldn't invite me because I was a woman. It was just amazing that they did that. But anyhow, the interesting point is that's what they did, and how they honored one. They would honor one person. And when we had a police department then, and the chief complained to me one day because they didn't have sergeants and things, he said he can't give anybody any kind of honors. I said, well, do what the fire department does. So we planned this thing, and the only thing was to once a year have one policeman who would be on the same way as the fire department. So interestingly, the first person who got appointed to that was Carl Filsinger, who is retiring this week. And he was the policeman, and he was the first one who they honored, but that way. Today, everybody wonders how come the police commission is the one who chooses an outstanding Weston person every year. Nobody knows why. Well, that's why.
Interesting. Before we go on, we should make a note about Fred Moore, because he was indeed important to the town. He started EMS, I think, or maybe not, but he was the kind of the civil defense person. And
well, what I found, the reason I thought he was great was because what had happened when we first came to town, they had a thing to take I took my little 2-year-old to sit in the fire engine, and I asked the fireman there, I said, how come every time a house catches on fire here, caught on fire when I first moved here, it would burn to the ground, and now they never do? He said, oh, that's because of Fred Moore, who's now the fire chief, and he goes to all these conventions and learns all this stuff and comes back and teaches us. So one night I was at a selectmen's meeting, and I was the only one there, of course, and there was Fred Moore on the agenda, and he was asking for a couple of $100 to go to some convention, and the selectmen all said, oh, ho, 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 Fred wants to go and have fun, and they denied him. I was furious because I remembered this about my son. So anyway, so I said to Fred, when he came by me, I said, Fred, come tomorrow morning and we will give you a check for that, and which we did, and that was how we ended up getting honored. Anyway.
Good for you. Let's move on a little to the controversies, the challenges that you witnessed over the years and reported on. Does one particular news item stick out in your mind, an event that the forum covered?
Well, there was several things. What is the disease that dogs get?
Rabies.
No, not rabies, but the one where right now you give them shots or pills once a week or once a day. I forget what the name of it is. It's the dogs.
A heart murmur?
The heart, yes, yes.
Oh, for heartworm.
Heartworm, exactly. Anyway, so one woman had written a letter to the editor, which was just heartbreaking, about what had happened to her dog. But this, because we'd never heard of this. Anyway, we had a man hired who in Weston who worked at the dump. This is when we had a dump. And he used to bring in hunting dogs from the south all the time. And sure enough, that's how this heartworm came to the whole Northeast in the United States. Anyway, meanwhile, so we wrote had printed her letter, which was just heartbreaking. Anyway, a woman had just arrived in town who was interested in dogs, which I didn't know about. She called me up and she said she's so interested in this and she wants to work on the paper. So we made her the dog editor. So she was our dog editor, and every week she would call up all the vets around, because it turned out that this heartworm was only contagious within a certain area. You just didn't get it. The dogs didn't get it far away. They had to be within a mile or something of the place. So she would go and ask all the veterinarians around who had the dogs, who had them, and we would print this column every week. And she became the dog editor. And then years later, when she was doing a training thing for dogs, and she asked me if I would come and take a picture one Saturday morning. I said sure. So I went to take a picture, and here was this photographer she had hired from Wilton, and he had this big camera on his shoulder. And every time I went to take a picture, he would turn around so only this big camera was in the way, and I could not get a picture of him. So I just took the picture of him with the camera, and that was that. A few weeks later, she called me up on a Sunday night, all excited. She said, "You must turn on the television right away." I forget his name, but he had just been arrested, and they had let everybody know he had just been the second highest communist spy ever in this country.
In Weston?
There he was. Yes, there he was living in Wilton, but he would come on Saturday morning to photograph her dog class. So, and the interesting thing was, years later, when my son was at Georgetown, and another kid from Weston was there, and sure enough, there was a course there, and in government, and what this professor said was they had always found out every single spy the government always found, pardon me, except one.
You want to take a break, Pat?
Okay.
Sure. We can take and start again.
Except one.
No, just leave it rolling.
Okay.
I'll just cut it out.
So, can I get you some?
No, stop.
Okay.
It should stop. That's my cough.
All right. I just didn't know whether you might.
No, I might. Maybe I will.
Feel free anytime.
All right, just take the glass and stick it under the sink. Okay, all I need is just a drop. Anyway, this is an interesting story because it's true.
Hang on just a second. We'll start it again.
Yeah. It's getting foggier and foggier out there. Oh, thank you very much. Very nice, thank you. Excellent. Okay.
So we found that there was a spy in Weston.
Well, what happened? Well, where did I stop? Because what the
You started
FBI
talking about your
the
son
first
in
selectman
Georgetown.
the first selectman had told me that somebody in Weston must be pushing drugs because the FBI had come, and they had come in to see her and told her that they were there looking around town. And she said, why else would the FBI come here? Well, of course, nobody knew about this at the time. So then he was found, this spy, and that was the end of Weston as far as the story went, until my son was in Georgetown. And then his friend, who was taking this course, and the professor said, oh, there's one spy who we've never caught. We never found out why he was, what his connection was. Because everybody always had a connector, you know, where they would pass on the information. And he said, it was some little town in Connecticut. And this kid raised his hand. He said, I know where it was. I read about it in the Weston Forum. That's who it was. Anyway, so I think that was our one of our best stories.
Over your time, over Weston's time in the last few decades, there have been quite a few controversies that I can remember, and you not only reported about them, but you spoke up at many public meetings. And tell us a few of those.
Yes, well, when we were getting cable, and we were very anxious to get cable television in, because we could only get, and people who were only high up could get the three main stations from New York, and that was it. So we were very anxious to get the cable, and there were a lot of things the town would get that would be the cable company was required to give to the towns when they came in. And so we were very anxious to get this in, and one day there was a man in town who's still in town, who was always looking out for always making a deal for himself. And sure enough, lo and behold, there was a selectmen's meeting, and I happened to be at that selectmen's meeting because I would have to cover everything that somebody didn't cover. So there I was at the selectmen's meeting, and this man was on the agenda. And so here, he stood up to talk, and he was there he introduced the man who he was with, who was the manager of the new cable that was coming into the area. And he said, now if we give up, all we have to do to get cable in here right away is to give up all these things, the $60,000 the schools were to get, all these different goodies that we were entitled to. That he said, if we give that all up, why then this manager who was there will start to get cable in Weston right away. So I raised my hand and I said, that's outrageous. We need those deals. We need that money for Weston. There's no reason why we should give it up. And if he can do it for money, he can do it. So that should be that. Let him do it and be done with it. And this guy stood up, this Weston person, he stood up and he flung his finger out at me and he said, she's in conflict of interest. And the first selectman said, why is she in conflict of interest? He said, because she has a newspaper. Well, I was just hilarious comparing me to the big cable company, my little newspaper. Anyway, we got the cable in, as you know.
Another one that I remember personally very well is your opposition to the $85 million, I think, that we spent on building the 345 school. And you were very outspoken about that.
You mean the recent one?
The recent one.
Oh, that was just before, because of the fact that we knew there were two men running for first selectman. One was first selectman, but they were beating out each other on everything they could. Anyhow, they knew perfectly well that we were going to have a decline in school enrollment. However, they sent out, one of them, the one who was first selectman at the time, sent out a big paper to everybody saying, oh, we need this school because our school enrollment is going to go way, way, way up. So I called Hartford and called the guy who I had dealt with there, who was the enrollment person, and I asked, what's the future for Weston School? He said, oh, your enrollment's going to go way down. So I called these two guys running for, the one running for first selectman who had sent out this big flyer, and I said, you know perfectly well that the enrollment's going down. I said, that's just a lie. He said, oh, everybody lies. I said, well, maybe you lie, but I don't. But I tried to stop it, but they sent out stuff and they got it through. So now it sits there, and we now have a well-reduced enrollment in Weston and extra school space that the taxpayers are finding they could be doing without.
Yeah. So we've got the cable controversy, and we've got the controversy over the schools. Any other?
Well, there are always
two?
little things that people would call up because they knew that they would get a hearing, they would get a space in the forum, they would be able to bring out their case. And one woman called up very unhappy because there was a man who was the head of the Historic District Commission, and he had decided that for some reason he wanted to get her, and she owned a building lot that was on a hill down, it just went practically straight down. I mean, there was no way you could build a colonial house on a lot like that. And so he wanted to put in his regulation, and he boasted about it to me, which was a big mistake because now I knew. So the woman called me up and she was in tears and she came over. She's going to lose her building lot because he's putting in this regulation that you could only build a colonial house in that district. And so I printed her whole story with her quotes and everything in it, and that was the end of that. He did not get away with it. But people found that the use of a newspaper, that they could use the newspaper. But we always checked. We didn't let people get away with the wrong things.
Yeah. Let me ask a little bit about town government and the way the government was run from your perspective. Are there any leaders of the town, important people in town that you felt really made a positive difference, or people who you felt frankly didn't do such a good job, or how did the government of Weston evolve?
I think Jim Daniel really did a very good job. He brought all kinds of commissions in and things.
When he was first selectman,
And then.
When was he his first selectman, do you remember?
It was, in fact, I used to call him up and talk to him all the time about these different commissions before I'd ever met him personally. So it must have been about 1970.
Mhm.
And then, in fact, recently his daughter told me about a situation that there had been we had a barber shop in the center in Weston. And I had taken my little boy there for his haircut. And when we were new in town, the barber had talked to me, and oh, you just moved to town and all this, and he said his son-in-law was a state trooper. And not a Weston we had a resident state trooper, but he didn't tell me who it was, and I didn't, and there was no news then or anything, I knew nothing. And so next thing, this Betty Frisk, who I told you about, decided she was gonna get, not allow this landfill to be the thing across from her, the lakeside. And so this barber, it turned out, had said, well, he had told me that his son-in-law used to stop there all the time. This woman started the rumor that there was a numbers game going in Weston, and that the one pushing it was Jim Daniel.
Oh, no.
Which was most hilarious, because he was an editor of the Reader's Digest and very reliable. Anyhow, she then said that that the local state trooper that Jim Daniel was responsible for saying things about the local state trooper. Well, then I remembered about what had happened. So then I knew what the whole story was. And so then but unfortunately I didn't have a forum at the time. So nobody ever knew, and Jim resigned. He did not run again. And he had done so much for the government in the town.
What, in general, do you think the selectmen and the other boards have served the town well over the years? Do you remember a period that was particularly positive or not so positive?
Some wasn't, some were. Now, one person who was did a lot for Weston was George Kadira. And some people did not think he did.
He was also a first selectman.
Yes, he was, and for a long time. But he did a lot for the town. But there's just so many things. I mean, there's just so much. You just have to go read the whole history of the town.
Yeah.
It just.
The character of the town. Weston has been known by some people as rural and sophisticated. There's been different names.
Well,
how would you characterize the town, and how would you characterize its change over these 4 or 5 decades?
The rural thing, keep Weston rural was the thing that Ellen Strauss had started. And in rural, it really doesn't mean that it was a farmland and that everybody was a farmer, but that was some technical term, which I was not familiar with, but she was, and said that this is a technical term. Keep rural does not mean being a farm, but Weston fit that category.
Does it have to do with 2-acre zoning?
Well, 2-acre zoning had gone in, of course, because there was which is interesting, there was no public water, no public sewers. Everybody had to have a septic tank. And in fact, Jim Daniel once told me to watch out for Bridgeport Hydraulic Company, because if they were trying to come into Weston, and if they came in, and even if you had a well, and they had their water pipe went near your house, near your property, near your street, you would still have to pay for all the water that you were getting out of your own well, because that was the law. So he had fought very hard to keep Bridgeport Hydraulic out, and it worked.
Another aspect of the character of the town is volunteerism, I think.
Very much.
Has that changed over the years?
Very much so. That was the big, see, at the time when the forum started and when we were building the town is what everybody was doing. And everybody contributed something to the town. And it just felt that everybody was a volunteer, and they were.
And that still runs true today, don't you think?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's only very partial. I think they have a lot of difficulty getting help on things, for volunteers. They, people, and then you'll notice cars lined up after school to where the mommies come to pick up their kids and take them. We never had that. We used to have the school buses, which you still have and are paying for. Nevertheless, but this is what they do. The mothers now either work or both work and spend a lot of time traveling their kids around, which we never did.
Has the attitude towards the schools changed? Were people less concerned about education, and they only became more concerned in the 60s or 70s? Is the attitude of the schools changed over time?
We had very few schools. We did not, for instance, when we moved to Weston, as I say, the North House had burned down and the one class was in Westport. The high school was in there was a junior high in Weston, and that was up to the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. Was it 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th? And then the 10th, 11th, and 12th went to Staples in Westport. And then Westport announced that they were getting too crowded and we'd have to move out. And so Weston then had a choice. And Weston was told to either build a high school or could go into the Easton Reading school, which was about to be built. And we were told that the school population would grow tremendously. And that was because they did not know anything about the Nature Conservancy going to come in, and they did not know that was going to happen. And so all that land that's now the Nature Conservancy in Weston, they figured would have houses and would have school kids on them. And so that's what they thought. And so everybody thought, well, if we're going to have all these kids, we may as well have a high school. So we built a high school. But there was very little school. I mean, that's all there was. There was an elementary school and then that junior high. That was all Weston had.
Yeah, talking about the Nature Conservancy reminds me about Devil's Den, Catherine Ordway. I don't know whether you knew her, and the whole sense of respecting our environment, respecting our water resources, and all of those things. How did that evolve over time?
Well, of course, Catherine Ordway bought the property in honor of her father. It was a 3M company that he had started, and it was people didn't know that, but all we knew that there was a lot of land up there, and that's about all. The only thing is that we ever knew about was once when a man got lost up there, and they had to call in the state dogs to find him. And it turned out, and everybody wondered, well, what was he doing up there? What was happening? And it turned out that he was angry at his wife, and that's so that's the one time we had the state dogs come in. Anyhow, we just didn't know, what was the significance of having all that land up there.
Has Weston done a good job of protecting its resources?
Oh, I think so. I think very much so. Except for one thing which Weston does not control. And Weston and Westport were the first towns to be in what's called they were planning to put in the whole state health districts. So the health district that Weston and Westport were in was the first one in the state. And the problem there is that Weston still is under control of that health district. And when we complained that what was happening in Weston, these great big houses, they were letting people put in 2 and 3 wells, and the permits were being given by the health district. And as far as I know, that's still happening today. And that certainly is not an advantage for Weston, and they can't control it unless we get out of the health district.
Take a look in the crystal ball. Do you envision any significant changes that might occur in Weston? Something about its character, for example. There's once again discussion about the shrinking of the grand list, the raising of the taxes, and how to make Weston more attractive, perhaps even consider a bit more commercial development. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, of course, from the very beginning, that was what everybody said, oh, if we had more, stores and things like that, why, then our taxes would go down, and we wouldn't, we tested it, and we did, in the League of Women Voters, we did research on it, and found out it just wasn't true, because if you put in all of this kind of commercial area, building and all, you needed a paid fire department, which is incredibly expensive, which we do not have now. We still have a volunteer fire department, and you needed more. I mean, there's all kinds of services. You needed sidewalks certain places and all kinds of things that were very expensive that we didn't have to do. So it really wouldn't have helped at all. But people come up with that all the time. But if you watch carefully, you'll see, if you look at their names, and look at who owns their property that they want to develop, and you'll see there's a connection.
You spoke about George Guidara earlier, and I
Yes.
can't resist my memory of him standing, talking about commercial development. People have always talked a little bit about, Lions Plain would be a nice place to do it. I remember George Guidara standing up very vigorously saying, if anyone wants to cross my stone wall, they'll pay for it.
Well, it's unfortunate. I mean, George ran into financial difficulty because he developed this property that they had up there, up off of Tannery Lane. And he developed that property, and the taxes went way up. And then he didn't want to pay, nobody likes to pay the taxes, but he knew, there's a way you can pass over, what do you call that? If you have a house and you sell it, you can trade it off for another like kind thing tax-wise and keep going.
Right.
And he then bought Cox Mill Inn. And it was a very expensive thing, and he had a lot of problems financially, and he lost a lot of property. He lost his property.
Let's talk a little bit about Pat Heifetz's legacy, not only in town and the importance of the forum and the things you contributed to the dialogue in town, the evolution of the town. Were they not in the room, or perhaps, what would people say about you?
What would they say about me?
Yes.
I never asked.
But
that's a good way to not find out.
But would people say you were blunt, outspoken, skeptical? How might they characterize you from your point of view?
Well, my point of view is that what they would be looking at would be the forum, and the forum was itself, and not me.
Yeah.
I mean, I just took care of the forum. That was all.
In addition to the forum, what do you think your legacy will be in the town?
I don't know if I would have a legacy. I mean, now I don't think I know 5 people in Weston anymore. Because of the fact that people, when their children grow up, and now, I mean, there are so many people who've moved in. School taxes have gotten so high that so many people said, well, when my kids are out of school, I'm out of here. I'm not paying these taxes for other people's kids, but of course we're paying for theirs. However, that is, I think, one of the big problems in Weston. I think that's going to change, because I don't know what's going to happen with the new, I mean, not having SORPA anymore, the planning agency. That'll change, and one day will come when all the schools are under one control, under the state, or they'll have big school districts. I don't think Weston will be able to continue as its own. I don't think home rule will go on in Connecticut for a long time.
Yeah,
I think
people are talking about that this regional, make the ambulance service a regional service, make the school district a regional school district to save money.
Well, it costs more when you get right down to it, because we did all those studies, and it always costs more. But yes, they want to do that, and a lot of people move in and they think that this is the way to go. And if they convince people, who knows? I think it would be too bad, because I think home rule, of course, is the secret that keeps Weston the way it is. And that, it is home rule.
Let's wrap this up by asking you, what questions should I have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Oh, well, listen, I mean, there are stacks of forms. You could go and read. Well, one time the IRS, after I'd had the forum a couple of years, the IRS called me in that this was a hobby. Because in the first place, a woman owning a newspaper, that had to be her husband, that had to be a hobby. So they called me in, so when I came in, I had all these framed, Boy Scouts and all these different things, and I filled up a bag with those things, with all the honors, and then I filled up a bag with newspapers, and I went there. And they showed me into the office, and here was this guy on the telephone. So he pointed to a chair for me to sit down. I sat down, and he's still on the phone, and there I sat. So I took my bags and I went to his window, and I put all these framed honors all around the windows. And I took my stack of papers, and I sat down, and I showed him this was a real newspaper. It was not my hobby, and here were all these newspapers. And he was supposed to call me back and let me know what happened. I never heard from them, so I called up, and they said, oh, well, he seems to have resigned. So that was the end of him.
So Pat,
Yes.
thank you so much for inviting us to talk with you this morning. And especially thank you so much for this contribution and your other contributions to the history of Weston. Thank you.
Well, thank you.